United States, and there will be a catch-up even with the United States by 2050. But there won't be a catch-up in per capita income. Now, these are sort of, in a sense, fairy tales that come out of the arithmetic of compound growth rates. And if we were to think of extrapolating the future, we would also have to look at whether or not the new Asian economies are capable of being engines of growth for the world economy in much the same way as the United States has been for a century, or Britain was for a century before then. Now, I dealt with this elsewhere at some work I did for Wider, and my answer is no, that these countries are not yet engines of growth. China is perhaps as a market for exports, but not for resources for investment, finances for development, technologies for productivity. India is a little bit behind, but potentially could be. However, they could be important complements to the United States. And they could be important drivers of growth in their respective regions. But much depends on whether they are able or not able to rely on their domestic markets to sustain growth. Okay? Now, the growth performance of the developing world during the second half of the 20th century is impressive in the aggregate, particularly when compared with the preceding 80 years, but it has been uneven across regions and countries. Such growth, even if it had been more evenly spread, is necessary but not sufficient. The essential failure, in my view, is that this rapid growth in the developing world has not been transformed into meaningful development, which has improved the living conditions or ensured the well-being of people, of ordinary people. And if we consider either the experience or the possibilities, there have been some countries without growth and without development, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Some countries that have had growth with development, without development, mostly in Latin America. And some countries that have had growth with development, mostly in East and Southeast Asia. Okay? But what is striking is that the developing world has not been able to translate this story of economic growth into meaningful development that improves the living conditions of people, ordinary people, essentially because there is a widening gap between developing countries and industrialized countries, between countries in the developing world. There is an exclusion of countries and of regions, the least developed countries in particular, and regions within countries. And there is an exclusion of people visible in persistent poverty or rising inequality. Now, I don't have time to take you through this, but if you look at world inequality in historical perspective, you can have three measures of inequality, okay? That we have a population unweighted country distribution. We treat that, we say that each country is one individual, okay? And the per capita income of that country determines the distribution of income in the world. Or a population-weighted country distribution. So China and India get a larger weight, Jamaica gets a smaller weight. And we can look at global inequality among people, the rich and the poor in the world, irrespective of where they live. Now, you would see that the population unweighted country distribution has gone up throughout. Okay? 1820 to 1913 rapidly, then in the interwar years it slowed down, and once again from 1950 it's gone up. But if we weight it for population, then we find that it begins to come down starting 1952. And that's largely because of China and India. And if you were to exclude China and India from it, inequality goes up, and it goes up significantly. Global income inequality has been very high. You can look at it, it rises from around 0.5, the Gini coefficient, to 0.6 between 1820 and 1914. but it's very, very high. Now, there is a widening gap between industrialized countries and developing countries. And if you really look at inequality in the world, 70% is attributable to inequality between countries and 30% to inequality within countries. You know? Because that's explicable, because there are political limits of tolerance to inequality within countries. Now, I won't burden you with the definition of the Thiel coefficient, but it's a clever concept for measuring inequality, and you can decompose it. Okay? And essentially what it tells you is that more than 80% of population-weighted inequality for all countries in the world is attributable to inequality between regions. You see that number 0.45 and 0.51, 0.51 and 0.56, 0.45 and so 80% of inequality in the world is attributable to inequality between regions. And more than that 80% is attributable to the difference between industrialized countries in West Europe and North America on the one hand and developing countries on the other. Okay? But it is also attributable to inequality within regions of the world. Okay? You will see that in every region of the developing world, these are population unweighted figures, the previous ones were population weighted, inequality has risen. The Thiel coefficient rises for Africa, for Asia, for Latin America, for the former USSR and Eastern Europe. It declines only for West Europe, North America and Oceania. Okay? So that we are witnessing a divergence in income between industrialized countries and developing countries. We are witnessing a divergence of income between countries in the developing world and indeed within regions in the developing world. Okay? And if you look at international inequality within regions of the developing world, it has increased everywhere except Latin America. And if we look at the ratio of per capita income of the richest country in a region, say Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the poorest country in that region, those multiples have grown. In Asia, for example, that ratio was 29:1 in 1960 and 113:1 in 2000. In Africa, it was 24:1 in 1960 and 118:1 in 2000. In Latin America, much less, it was 16:1 in 1960 and 2000:1 in 37. Okay? Now, basically, as I do not have more time, I want to say to you that there is a striking exclusion of countries, the least developed countries, of regions, the western hinterland of China, many parts of India, and there is an exclusion of people, where the work of Wider unambiguously shows what has been happening to poverty and inequality. Okay? Let me quickly draw this to a close. If we think of, well, is it then possible to speculate or hypothesize about the future prospect of developing countries in the world economy? The past is relevant, and so is the present. There are underlying factors which suggest a strong potential for growth, but there are also real constraints on future growth. Much would depend, I believe, upon whether or not developing countries can alleviate these constraints. In the ultimate analysis, it is essential for them to transform economic growth into meaningful development that improves the well-being of people. If this happens, it would reinforce the process of growth and development through accumulative causation. If it does not happen, developing countries will find catch-up difficult and will continue to lag behind. Now, if we look at economic determinants of potential growth, there's good news. The population in these countries is large and income levels are low. Their demographic characteristics, the high proportion of young people in the population, would mean an increase in their workforce for some time to come. That could be conducive to growth if they create capabilities amongst these people. Wages are significantly lower than in the world outside, where there are large reservoirs of surplus labor that can be drawn into productive employment. And productivity increase was possible with ease because we are starting at very low levels. There is an extensive margin of drawing people from agriculture with almost no productivity into some productivity in non-agriculture. An absorption of surplus labor. What is more, new technologies are much easier to absorb, replicate, and learn. They are rather different from the old technologies that drove the Industrial Revolution in Europe. But there are constraints on future growth, specific constraints in different countries. If you think of the examples of leaders, China has a declining productivity of investment at the margin, and the sustainability of its political system is open to question. India has a deep crisis in agriculture. It has bottlenecks in agriculture. It's a limited spread of education in society. If you look at examples of the laggards, you look at Congo, which has almost no infrastructure, no institutions, no education. Then there are general constraints that are common to developing countries: infrastructure, institutions, education, political processes. There are possible constraints that may arise from growth: economic exclusion, social conflict, environmental stress, climate change. And there are some constraints that are exogenous to developing countries, such as the present crisis in the global economy. Now, I believe that what happens in the future depends significantly on what developing countries do to ease these constraints. Poverty eradication, employment creation, and inclusive growth are the essential objective of development, but also the primary means to the end. In a sense, this is both constitutive of development and instrumental in development. And therefore, if developing countries are able to absorb surplus labor, develop an infrastructure, spread education in society, develop policies, institutions, and governance, they will get to both the constitutive and instrumental end of development. But in a sense, this is going to require a great transformation in the developing world. In the Polanyi sense, and that may be easier now, of using the state and the market as complements, but also in a more fundamental sense of creating more inclusive growth. It is the only sustainable way forward to developing countries. And economic growth with human development and social transformation from within is perhaps the only answer. Okay. If you will permit me 5 minutes, I will draw together the conclusions. I know I have stretched your patience just a little. Now, in the span of world history, developing countries are a relatively recent phenomenon that emerged about 150 years ago. At the beginning of the second millennium, in 1000 AD, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, may I remind you, taken together, accounted for 82% of world population and 83% of world income. Their dominance, even if somewhat diminished, continued for the next 8 centuries. Indeed, in 1820, less than 200 years ago, these 3 continents still accounted for about 3/4 of the world's population and about 2/3 of the world's income. The transformation of the world economy began around then. It was driven by the Industrial Revolution in England, the advent of colonialism, and the revolution in transport and communication through the railway, the steamship, and the telegraph. The rise of Western Europe and the decline of Asia were the outcomes of this process. The division of the world into industrialized countries, mostly in temperate climates, and developing countries, mostly in tropical climates, was clear by 1870. The next 80 years witnessed a rapid economic decline, particularly in Asia, as the share of developing countries in world output, manufacturing, and trade collapsed. But there was more to this great divergence. Between 1870 and 1950, as a proportion of per capita incomes in Western Europe and North America, per capita incomes in Asia fell from 1/2 to 1/10, in Africa from more than 1/3 to less than 1/7, and in Latin America from 3/5 to 2/5. The economic recovery of developing countries in the world economy began circa 1950. It was attributable in part to strategies and policies in the post-colonial era that created the initial conditions and laid the essential foundations for development. The period 1951-80 witnessed rapid economic growth almost everywhere in the developing world, which provided a sharp contrast with the near stagnation in the colonial era. This growth slowed down during the period 81-2005, particularly in Africa and Latin America, but growth in industrialized countries also slowed down, while growth in Asia continued at explosive rates. Consequently, there was a rapid increase in the share of developing countries in international trade, industrial production, and world output. And circa 2005, the significance of developing countries in the world economy, I find, was about the same as it was in 1870. But per capita income in developing countries, as a proportion of that in industrialized countries, did not return to the proportion in 1870, largely because the share of developing countries in world population rose from 2/3 in 1950 to more than 4/5 in 2005. It would seem that in the aggregate, the decline of developing countries in the world economy during the 80 years from 1870 to 1950 has been almost made up for during the 60 years from 1950 until now. It is, however, important to stress that the impression of widespread development is misleading because aggregates are deceptive. Much of the catch-up is attributable, as I have argued, to about a dozen countries. Of course, some concentration is inevitable, and it is not new. All the same, regional differences in economic performance within the developing world are striking, and there is more divergence than convergence in income when compared with the industrialized countries. Many poor countries and poor people continue to lag behind. Indeed, there is exclusion of countries and of people reflected in persistent poverty and rising inequality. The essential problem is that rapid economic growth has not been transformed into meaningful economic development, which would improve the living conditions of ordinary people. Yet, there is a strong potential for growth in developing countries in terms of economic determinants and underlying factors. There are also real constraints. Even so, the potential, I think, can be realized. The obvious needs which would be conducive to growth are development of infrastructure, spread of education, appropriate policies, essential institutions, and good governance. But growth in developing countries can be sustained only if it is inclusive through poverty eradication and employment creation, so that it mobilizes their most abundant resource, people, in the pursuit of development. It is necessary to recognize that the significance of developing countries in the world would be shaped not only in the sphere of economics, but also in the realm of politics. Their emerging significance in the world economy is attributable in part to their share in world population and in world income, and in part to their engagement with the world through international trade, investment, and finance. What is more, structural change in these economies has made them emerging competitors rather than perpetual losers in the world market. And the technology of the Industrial Revolution is passé. The new technologies are different. Learning, replication, leapfrog are possible, which has made developing countries more than competitive in the world market. And the mid-2000s are perhaps a turning point. Even so, in their economic sphere, their potential importance in future far exceeds their actual importance at present. In the realm of politics, however, their importance is even more discernible at the present juncture, which is attributable in part to their size in terms of population, which is young rather than old, and in part to their size in terms of geographical space. It is plausible to argue, though impossible to prove, that this represents the beginnings of a profound change in the balance of economic and political power in the world. History does not repeat itself, but it would be wise to learn from history. The early 19th century was a turning point in world economy. It was the beginning of the end of Asia's dominance in the world, and it was the beginning of the rise in Europe, in particular Britain, to dominance in the world. The early 20th century was the next turning point. It was the beginning of the end of Britain's dominance in the world, and it was the beginning of the rise of the United States to dominance in the world. The catch-up and transformation spanned half a century. The early 21st century perhaps represents a similar turning point. It could be the beginning of the end of the dominant status of the United States in the world. The emergence of countries outside North America and Western Europe, particularly the powerhouse economies in Asia, which began with the East Asian success stories and is now manifest in the rise of China and India, represent a striking transformation. In addition, there are emerging economies in other continents of the developing world, among which Brazil, South Africa deserve mention. Of course, in the decades to come, the continued rise of these countries, or the developing world as a whole, is not quite predictable and by no means certain. It would depend, as I have argued, in large part on whether developing countries can transform themselves into inclusive societies where economic growth, human development, and social progress move in tandem. This catch-up and transformation, if it materializes, could span half a century or longer. Yet, the beginnings of a shift in the balance of power are discernible, and the past could be a pointer to the future. Thank you. I'm sorry I took 10 minutes longer than I should have.
Thank you very much for a very informative and entertaining talk. As I'm listening to it, I'm struck how we managed to get very topical talks in these annual lectures. Last year we had a talk on climate change, when climate change was the topic of the time. Now everyone's thinking about the financial crisis. And I think one of the consequences of that is that we're beginning to be challenged about our presumptions about, in the past we tended just to think that the world's going to continue in a way that it has been in the recent past. And now our presumptions have certainly been shaken. And this attempt to, it really encourages us to go back to basics, to rethink about the history of economic relationships, to see in a way, I won't say where we went wrong, but to make sure that we understand better the sort of factors which come together. And I think this is, in that respect, a very timely contribution to encouraging us to think very in long term about the history of the world. And I think the other thing which really struck me is how ambitious this is in both the coverage. We're here thinking about the whole world, and the time, of course, 2,000 years of economic history. So that, I think, is what I gained from this talk, and I say, in that respect, I think it's particularly timely, given that peoples are focused on the financial crisis and the consequences for the future. At the same time, I mean, Deepak manages to perhaps answer some of the questions, maybe not questions that you even thought about, but provides lots of interesting information on these historical trends. But at the same time, I think raises a lot of questions for, at least in my mind, thoughts about questions which are prompted by the talk. So, as I said, we now have an opportunity to talk about, to invite the audience to raise some questions, and we have two roving microphones which we can use for that purpose. So I don't know who would like...
Shall I come over there, Tony? Is that easier, or stay here?
I think you're probably better there, I would say. Particularly because some people might want you to slides and things. Let me, so anyone who wants to do start, but it would be quite nice if you perhaps mentioned who you are or something that might be relevant to your question. I'm going to just throw in my question right at the beginning, is because I'm struck by the fact that you use all these PPP calculations. These are purchasing power parity calculations which try to adjust for differences in the expenditure value of currencies in different countries. As of everyone may know that last year there was a major change in these PPP values, and so I suspect that all the PPP calculations you were quoting were the old PPP values, and I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong, but certainly there's been quite a significant adjustment in those figures, and most of the figures tend to increase the prices that are attributable to developing countries, and therefore will tend to reduce the income shares and so on measured when you convert to the new PP values relative to the old. But I'm just sort of throwing that up as an initial question while we get the other members of the audience to
Thank you so much
introduce
indeed.
their questions.
This is Najmal Hassan from Findia Business Academy. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. My question is, in fact, which you have partly answered already, is how do you see the developed countries in the world economy, and what is their future in the past, and especially in the context of smaller countries in Europe, Finland included, where, for example, the determinants such as size, growth, and history, which are quite different from the determinants that you correctly pointed out for the developing countries. How should small countries look to that future in the past?
Do you want to answer questions as they...
Maybe I could do it two at a time, because first, your question, Tony, on how reliable are the purchasing power parity numbers that I have used in this exercise. First, let me say that by and large, I've used Angus Madison's somewhat better method of 1990 Kerry Chemist International Dollars. And I've used it for the entire period, from 1820 to 2001. Now, the change in PPP figures that has taken place last year is really in the UN PPP exercises, or more the World Bank PPP exercises. And I did use some of those numbers. In fact, they show a catch-up in terms of share of world income. They don't show a catch-up in terms of GDP per capita. By the way, in some work that was finished a short while ago, I redid the calculus on the southern engines of global growth story, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, on the revised PPP numbers, and it makes little difference to the outcome. Second question, how will the developed countries, the industrialized countries, industrial societies, cope with or adjust to this change? The good news is that industrial societies have, on the whole, witnessed an inclusive growth. Although in the past 25 years, work shows that economic inequality has grown enormously. And that's the bad news. My own sense is how they cope with this structural change in the world economy will depend in large part on their responses. Japan's response was poor because they were caught in a debt deflation and declining productivity for a long period of time and have just about got their act together. So it will depend in part on the response of countries. My own sense is that countries in Nordic land are better equipped. The smaller countries, the latecomers, are better equipped to cope with the structural change because they have more inclusive, more egalitarian societies, which gives them opportunities for adjustment that are much deeper than those characterize countries with high inequalities. So smaller countries, more egalitarian societies, I think will adjust easier. But that's one part of the story. The other part of the story really relates to how the financial crisis and the global downturn is going to lead industrialized countries into adjustment. Now, there can be no doubt that this is the deepest crisis in Western capitalism since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And how long it takes to recover from that process and what structural adjustment it leaves in its wake will depend significantly on policy responses. So how the industrialized world fares in whole or in parts in the economic sphere will depend on the initial conditions in each of these countries and the policy responses of each of these countries. What is much more difficult to predict in a world with a changing balance of power, of political power, is how the industrialized world that has dominated the world polity for a century is going to adjust to that changed balance of power. We have moved from the age of competition between communism and capitalism to a much more unipolar system, to a much more clear hegemony. And that is going to change. And I think how industrialized countries fare in that domain will also determine how the world adjusts. It was the limited ability of Europe and the industrialized world to accept latecomers to industrialization in the world economy that led to 2 world wars. Many people have argued that. So in a sense, in economics, and that's a 2-sentence answer, it depends on initial conditions in the countries and their policy responses. In politics, I think it depends on sagacity and wisdom to recognize the changing realities of the world, and that we should not have to wait for a crisis of the proportions that we lived through in the Great Depression or through the Second World War to readjust in that mode. And I think, in a sense, in the global economic crisis, I see a global political opportunity. That it is going to be important for the G5 to recognize that there is a developing world out there, uneven, unequal, in large parts still poor, whether countries or people, but they are going to be very important determinants of how the world will evolve. And I think, in a sense, political sensitivity is going to be more important in this changed balance of power than economic response. But both will matter.
Thank you. We have another question.
Thank you. My name is Peter Ball. I'm a trade union economist from Finland. You mentioned, sir, in your quite interesting speech, as one central form of participation in the international economy, migration. And during the last years, it has been a quite central issue in the trade negotiations in the WTO, especially the so-called GATS Mode 4 has been. And as far as I know, for example, India has been quite strong demanding the developing countries to open up their borders for non-skilled labor imports, creating a situation where, according to my interpretation, these countries are creating a situation where labor is a commodity, contrary to the leading principles of the ILO, which stated already in 1948 in its Philadelphia Declaration that labor is not a commodity and should not be treated as a commodity. But now too many countries, not least India and Egypt, are creating a situation where they use their surplus labor as a commodity, are trying to sell it, as has been doing for quite a long time already, the Philippines government. And then you also mentioned in your conclusions that politics is crucial, and especially when we look at the crisis now, we see that the way the economists have been thinking ain't necessarily right way forwards. And here I think especially too many people think that the only productivity forces is inequality, whereas I think that the small, for example, Nordic countries, the Netherlands and so on, quite clearly prove that equality is productive. And here my question is there any hope for rethinking on this point in the developing world? That they see that the labor, the people and equality are positive forces, and where, for example, diverse forms of popular movements, for example, the trade unions, are driving forces in development and not a hindrance, as they seems to be counted as in too many international organizations. Thank you.
Why don't you can respond now. I think it's easier to
Okay.
each question.
First, your question or comment about international migration and the engagement of developing countries with the world in this sphere. I would like to make a clear distinction between what is the movement of people from one country to another that can be characterized as emigration. Okay? And what is the movement of people from one part of the world to another to deliver a service. That is a temporary movement of workers for a limited duration and for a specified purpose. So, in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS Mode 4, developing countries are simply negotiating for more symmetry in the process. That just as commercial entities have a right of establishment or a right of commercial presence, say in delivering services in the financial sector or in other technology-intensive domains, developing countries should have the right of commercial presence or establishment in terms of delivering labor-intensive services. They are two analytically separable issues. Now, I believe that in the WTO world of negotiations under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, there is need for greater symmetry than has been provided so far in the movement of capital or of labor to deliver capital-intensive or labor-intensive services. And that must continue. But the question of international migration is somewhat different, where you may on the one hand have the movement as a right of human beings, it's enshrined in the UN Charter, and yet there is also the right of countries to ensure social cohesion, also enshrined in the UN Charter. And that will for a long time remain in the domain of national governments, national parliaments, whether it's immigration laws or consular practices. But I am not in the business of futurology. Any economist who is treading on dangerous ground. But I think that in the next 10 years, we are going to see an aging of industrial societies, which is going to diminish the number of producers and increase the number of consumers, which is going to diminish the number of workers and increase the number of pensioners. And industrial societies are going to need people, not simply as workers to sustain levels of output or provide essential services, but they are going to need people for healthcare and for home care. And we are going to witness, I think, by 2020, a major need for the import of labor, permanent or temporary, in industrial societies. And this is going to have to come from developing countries. And it is time for the world then to think about the multilateral framework that would govern the cross-border movements of people, not to take away the sovereign right of nation states to promulgate immigration laws or develop consular practices, but to make sure that it follows two principles. of non-discrimination, you know, what is most favored nation clause and what is national treatment in the WTO. So I think it would be much better for the world to evolve a multilateral framework to govern the cross-border movements of people, going beyond Mode 4 in the GATS, but not quite saying that there will be a free movement of people everywhere in the world. But when countries are going to import labor and countries are going to export labor, a multilateral framework that is based on consultations and negotiations between the two, I think, is both necessary and desirable. On your second point, I'm not entirely sure that I followed the entire logic of your comment or of your question, but it seems to me that we agree. That I believe that in coping with the changing balance of economic and political power in the world over the next half a century, it is politics that is going to be in command, and economics will follow. But we also agree that just as the smaller industrial societies, smaller countries, Nordic countries are better equipped because they are more inclusive societies, they are more egalitarian societies, to cope with the process of adjustment. I thought I argued, but maybe I didn't argue with enough clarity or emphasis, that the ability of developing countries to turn their past into the future really depends on them becoming inclusive societies. If economic growth, social progress, human development go hand in hand, they are going to be able to cope much more with the global economic crisis in the short run, and they're going to be able to transform their growth into development in the long run.